Hi, I'm Frances Chiu. My paper is Darkness Visible, Le Fanu's Mysterious Lodger and the Politics of Union. The Mysterious Lodger is arguably one of Sheridan Le Fanu's least examined but creepiest novellas. For years it was overlooked, possibly because of William McCormack's initial reluctance to claim authorship for Le Fanu. What I want to do here is show how this story, published in the pages of the Dublin University Magazine during January and February 1850, allows us to further question the widely held assumption of Le Fanu's unionist sympathies. In particular, I want to push some of Julianne Yulin's conclusions on the mysterious lodger even further by reading it in the context of Irish nationalist discourse on the famine as found in the Young Irelander speeches of Thomas Meagher in the Dublin University Magazine. Because many readers are unfamiliar with the mysterious lodger, I thought I'd begin with a brief synopsis. In a nutshell, it's a predecessor of the Roommate from Hell horror story. The narrator is a landlord in precarious financial circumstances, seeking a renter for his large house in London. While playing nearby, his young daughter happens to receive an unexpectedly generous offer from a large, apparently wealthy man in a yellow waistcoat with a crutch, who tells her that his friend wants to rent a room for 6 months. In due time, this friend, the eponymous mysterious lodger, arrives, a cadaverous-looking man dressed in black with a face covered by green goggles, a scarf, and a respirator. Though somewhat frightened, the landlord is happy with him. Both are adamant skeptics or infidels. Yet the landlord soon experiences disturbing phenomena, like seeing and hearing a crutch which the lodger denies is there, or seeing the figure of a human figure under a heap of clothes, in addition to a large cat that the lodger also denies seeing. Others in the household become increasingly unnerved, particularly his wife, when the lodger mocks her Christian piety. She begs the narrator to get rid of him, but he refuses to leave despite the promise of a refund. Tragedies begin to occur, first the death of the landlord's son and then of his daughter. In the meantime, the landlord meets a kindly Christ-like man who advises him to confront the lodger and leave and flee the house. After the couple moves out, strange things continue to occur, even as another family moves in. Only when the house is destroyed is peace supposedly restored. So, what might have inspired Le Fanu? I'm going to offer here my own modest proposal, namely that this novella may have been prompted by nationalist discourse by radicals and conservatives alike. In short, that Ireland was all but completely destroyed by a foreign British government during the famine, and that as such, the Act of Union needed to be repealed. Here, it's worth examining some of Thomas Mar's Young Irelander ideas from the late 1840s. Observing that the Union was carried by Irishmen receiving English gold, he complained that the promises of prosperity and profits made by Prime Minister William Pitt were at best illusory. From the enactment of martial law in 1803 to the confiscation of Ireland, as famine piles upon it a pyramid of coffins. Elsewhere, after mentioning a government of gravedigger, Marr lashed out at those rejecting the discussion of repeal by underscoring the need not only to reclaim political power, but to protect actual physical existence because self government was a question of self preservation. Marr also feared that the Union would destroy the spiritual elements of the people, from which elements the people derive true nobility. Here, it's worth highlighting the repeated emphasis on the very foreignness of English rule. Ireland was to be rescued from the control of every English minister. Marr deplored how the Irish were governed by an English minister, the nominee of the English Commons, while the laws were made by an English parliament, independent of the Irish. The secretary was a stranger, an English nobleman. Marr would urge Galway voters not to vote for Whigs, who were the leaders of Parliament then. There must be no delegate authorized to sustain the dictation of the English Commons. But Irish landlords were not blameless either. They had sacrificed the interests of Ireland for too long. In order to save their property, they must save their country. And to save their country, they must assert Irish freedom. If we turn to the conservatives, we detect certain shared sentiments, even if many opposed the revolutionary outbreaks of 1848. Some deplored the injustice of the Union, while others called for the creation of an Irish party. They too remarked that the Archbishop of Dublin, the chief administrator of the Irish Poor Law, and chief commissioner of the Irish Public Works were all Englishmen, so that whilst the Irish belong to Ireland, Ireland does not belong to the Irish. Naturally, I was curious to see what the Tory-leaning Dublin University Magazine had to say during the height of the famine from 1847 to 1850 to get a better idea of the immediate context of the mysterious lodger. In January 1847, the magazine lashed out at the handling of the famine, criticizing the newly imposed Irish poor law and the levying of taxes on Irish landlords. Why were the British contributing so little despite the Union? It was all too clear, as one writer put it, that the British Parliament is legislating in hostility against Irish landlords. Nor was the magazine afraid to openly broach the idea of federalism and repeal, observing that the attachment of many to the British Constitution had been shaken. How was it possible that no inquiry was made regarding the deaths of thousands of people? Indeed, the Union was one of loss and never of profit to the Irish, where the British had all the advantages, because the subsequent deliberations of the cabinet were too much influenced by the fear of offending powerful British interests, and too little to the safety of the Irish people. Such was bound to create among all classes a feeling of deep dissatisfaction, not only with the ministry, but with English rule. It's worth mentioning, too, that the message of these political articles was frequently amplified by the poetry. For instance, in 1849, the Dublin University Magazine featured a poem on northern India critical of English imperialism. This was followed by two poems on the famine, the Emigrant's Ship poem and the Emigrant's Tomb poem. The magazine would go so far as to say that the actions of the British bode more peril to the Union than all the insurrectionary movements and monster meetings of 1843. It was the British government rather than the sedition mongers which was steering a course towards repeal. In fact, this idea would be reiterated in May 1847, January 1848, and May 1849. The magazine would also emphasize, much like the Young Irelanders, how the poor law was devised in that spirit of indirect legislation of which this misgoverned country has so much reason to complain, even as it deplored the seditious ravings of Mitchell and Duffy elsewhere. As they saw it, the handling of the famine was flawed from the beginning. An article from April 1847, supposedly written by future Home Rule advocate Isaac Butt, explained how the famine was carelessly dismissed in its early stages as the invention of the agitators on either side of the water. Meanwhile, a committee in Dublin was accused of deluding the public with a false alarm. At the same time, much like Marr, the magazine did not entirely let did not let Irish bigwigs off the hook either. It was all too likely political motives contributed a less creditable share to the silence of the nation, with politicians refusing to censure the minister because of favors exchanged. The magazine would also blame Irish representatives for encouraging and inviting the further oppressions with which we are menaced. But the handling of the famine was not the only problem in conservative eyes. Many resented the diminution of the power and influence enjoyed by the Anglican Church of Ireland, a point made by Marr and Mitchell, albeit with less emphasis. In January 1848, for instance, the magazine declared that the clergy of the established church have been despoiled, the Protestant people have been insulted and wronged. The currying of Catholic favor was worrisome as the scriptural education is renounced and condemned. Not least, it's worth pointing out the sensational rhetoric that runs throughout these articles where words like horror, evil, gloomy, and calamity appear throughout. For instance, the article on the Poor Law from March 1849 mentions the sight of dead and dying paupers while criticizing the evils which have been affected through the agency of British law. The Poor Law is baneful and indiscriminating as the pestilence, while the Prime Minister's recommended measures are sinister and malign as well as monstrous. As I shift back to the mysterious lodger, it's worth pointing out in his memoir of Young Ireland a few decades later that Charles Gavin Duffy would comment on Le Fanu, stating that he had been associated with Mr. Butt in a conservative organization and, like him, could not resist the mesmerism of new opinions. In many ways, the mysterious logic can be worked as a work of darkness visible, shedding some light on Le Fanu's political ideas. If the darkness in the lodger's room is illuminated by the darkness from outside, the politics of the time are similarly illuminated by Le Fanu's dramatic rendering of domestic invasion. Although I hesitate to view the novella as a straightforward allegory of an Ireland governed by Britain, many of the details do point in that direction, beginning with the description of the house. First of all, we might know that it was built in 1672 and that it was certainly old enough to have become acquainted with iniquity. Le Fanu's Irish readers may have associated that date with the final year of martial law, which extended from 1569 to 1672, thereby also placing it 2 decades prior to the passing of the penal laws in Ireland. One might even wonder if the large rectory house with its porch and surrounding wall is not based loosely upon Dublin Castle, with parts of it rebuilt around the same period. And perhaps the 1822 setting of the story is not altogether accidental either, since it was a year of a severe famine that affected the western and southern portions of Ireland. But perhaps more interesting and meaningful still are the parallels between the landlord's acceptance of the offer from the large pale man with a crutch and the Anglo Irish acceptance of the Union. We know that there are contrasting expectations for the Union, as it was welcomed by some Protestants and less so by the others, and less so by others from the beginning. So while the prospective landlord is elated by the man's offer, it's striking that his young daughter harbors a few doubts when she describes him as old and frightful and appearing very angry. Was his character inspired by the idea of a malign and brutal England making an offer to Ireland? Moreover, the idea of England as an alien entity, one that I've discussed at some length in my introduction to Le Fanu's Roads of the Key, is further amplified in the odd figure of the mysterious lodger himself, Mr. Smith, a surname that might have immediately conveyed his Englishness. But the lodger be said to represent the British authorities in Ireland, not unlike Lord Lieutenant in Dublin Castle taking orders from far off invisible British government, or any of those English officials in Ireland mentioned by Marr in the Dublin University Magazine. Moreover, if the Irish and the English did view each other as aliens, it's perhaps not altogether surprising that the muffled up Smith has an alien appearance with his goggles and respirator. Later on, he is described as unnatural, strange, and hateful. Indeed, the collective control over the landlord's house exerted by the man in the yellow waistcoat, the lodger, angry, strange, hateful, sinister, and frightful, evoke nationalist impressions of a coercive Britain governing Ireland both within and without during the famine. In fact, the character of the landlord himself might be said to align with that of the sophisticated Anglo Irish English worshipping landlord, as he shares the lodger's brand of atheism while condescendingly ridiculing his wife's religious fervor. If the landlord enjoys Voltaire, Hume, Tom Paine, and Shelley, note that none of these writers are Irish. He is proud of knowing, at least by name, every work published in England during the last 50 years in favor of that philosophy in which we both delighted. It is equally striking that even though the landlord is shaken from the very beginning by the strange incidents in the lodger's room, he stoutly denies any discomfort. Certainly, when the landlord's wife detects his unusual paleness, he pretends that nothing's wrong. This recalls the initial denials of the seriousness of the famine as noted by the Dublin University Magazine. When the couple grows more fearful of the lodger, husband and wife agree not to speak of it to anybody, not to divulge any of their misgivings respecting the stranger, in their efforts not to scare off the children and servants. Here, it is really not too much of a stretch to regard this part of the plot as a reworking of the idea that Irish landlords and representatives were reluctant to confront and criticize the actions of the British government. This hesitation becomes even more apparent at a later stage in the novella, after the lodger brazenly enters the couple's bedroom. The landlord undergoes a palsy terror, feeling frozen to death, unable to move, unable to utter a cry. Indeed, it's worth pointing at the political balances in the landlord's description here. Far from wanting to accost the lodger, he would have recoiled at his very sight, and such was the ascendancy which he acquired over me, as well as everybody else in my household, in his own quiet, irresistible, hellish way. Note the use of the word ascendancy. I don't think the use of this word is at all fortuitous. This reminds us of the remark from the Dublin University Magazine that whilst the Irish belong to Ireland, Ireland does not belong to the Irish. And here, the house no longer seems to belong to the landlord's family. Nor is it entirely accidental that the children die of illnesses associated with the famine. It is telling that in the first instance, the baby falls ill after being touched by the lodger. In the second, the lodger is seen holding the girl in his lap. If the baby is believed to have suffered from suppressed smallpox and typhus, the description of the unblinking daughter who stares into space as if she's seen an unseen specter reminds us of this description of an infant in the May 1847 issue of the Dublin University Magazine. It sits with clear, sharp eyes that did not wink, but stared stock still at vacancy, as if a glimpse of another existence had eclipsed its vision. So when the landlord states that the sense of helplessness intensified the misery of her situation, the memory of famine is further amplified, especially when he points out that a poor house or dungeon would have been cheerful, a comparison that immediately invokes the memory of the poorhouses built during the famine. The lingering attention of the coffins of the children also invoke Mar's words on the pyramid of coffins and government of gravediggers. Likewise, the possibility of a live burial of the daughter equally summon up the image of the many who were said to have been buried alive as gravediggers rushed to bury the dead. Nor can we ignore the allusions to emigration as the couple flees the house. Finally, the novella might be said to express the religious anxieties articulated by a number of Irish Protestants. If Marr and the writers of the Dublin University Magazine pointed out the shrinking wealth and privileges of the Church of Ireland, while still others deplored the extended period of discrimination against Catholics, it is not surprising that the idea of religious piety is vindicated. We might note at the very beginning that the landlord declines an offer from a clergyman of great ability and zealous piety. However, his religious character displeased the landlord because he did not wish his children's heads to be filled with mythic dogmas, or so he judged doctrines of his holy faith. But after the death of his children, he encounters a Christ like man who is described as having a grandeur of intellect in his countenance, in his language, in his mien that was beautiful and king like. He feels a delightful awe and a humbleness more gratifying than an elation of earthly pride, and learns to deal with the calamities dealt to him. We are thus reminded of Mar's words on the idea of Irish independence, renewing the spiritual elements of the people, and the final lines of the January 1847 article on the famine. Never was there an occasion so fitting that our sovereign and her people should bow in submission to the mysterious will of the great being who rules us all, and earnestly implores mercy for a suffering land, and that blessing without which the wisest of human legislation is vain. The solemn offering up of a nation's confession and prayer to God is not the mere homage of a ceremony form, but a reality from which, with the deepest reverence and without daring and presumption to point out how the prayers of the people of the sovereign may be answered, we look for an answer and a blessing on the nation from on high. Not least, I'd like to add that the mysterious lodger seems to offer a rebuttal of sorts English newspapers and realist fiction of the 1840s, which portrayed the Irish as dangerous, disease ridden, and seditious invaders of Ireland. So, in this sense, Le Fanu might indeed have been rendering darkness visible. Thank you.